let's now transition into hadith. But very briefly, one point about taqlid before we examine a few hadiths. Historically, in the beginning of Islam, the word taqlid was used negatively. In fact, there are some hadiths that condemn taqlid. Why? What is the meaning of those hadiths? Very briefly, taqlid at the time meant following someone blindly, without evidence. What the pagans would do, just finding their forefathers on a path of worshipping idols, let's do the same. The Quran condemns this idea of taqlid. The Imams of Ahlulbayt, the Prophet ﷺ, they all condemn this. So if you find a hadith, because today some people are acting smart, he'll pull out one hadith, which we can even discuss the chain of it. Sometimes it's not even a solid chain. See, the Imam himself is condemning taqlid. Well, what type of taqlid is the Imam condemning? So when you look at the context of those words, ijtihad and taqlid had a negative connotation. Ijtihad meant at the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, the word ijtihad, jurisprudence, which we translate it today, meant that you use your own opinion when you are dealing with a text. You use your own opinion and insert it when you're dealing with a text like Quran or hadith. And this is something that Abu Hanifa did. He did not work within the text to understand it. He would actually come up with his own opinions and insert them into religion. That is the ijtihad that the Imams condemned. But a scholar who's true to the text does not do that. The scholar says, I examine the text, I'm trying to understand the text. I'm not coming up with something and adding it to the text. Abu Hanifa would do that. That's the condemned ijtihad. And the condemned taqlid is to follow people like that, because they have no authority to be followed when they're inserting their own opinions. So just keep that in mind. If you ever come across a hadith that's condemning taqlid, that's the type of taqlid it's condemning. Let's examine the first hadith here. In one Sahih hadith, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam tells his companion, Aban ibn Taghlib. He was one of the good companions of Imam Sadiq. The Imam tells him, An-Najashi mentions this hadith in his book Ar-Rijal, page 10. Ijlis fi masjid al-Madina. Sit in the mosque of Medina. Wa afti nas. Give fatwa to the people. فَإِنِّي أُحِبُّ أَنْ أَرَى فِي شِيعَتِي مِثْلَكَ. I love to see amongst my Shia people like you. Look at this hadith. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is telling Aban, who was a scholar, he was an expert trained by the Imam. The Imam tells him, sit in the masjid and issue fatwas to the people. I love to see qualified scholars like you from our Shias doing that. So the Imam is commanding his companion to issue fatwas. Now, when the Imam is commanding Aban ibn Taghlib to issue fatwas, isn't there an assumed command from the Imam that if you hear the fatwas of Aban, take them? Or no, there is no such assumed command? What do you say? Of course there is. So if someone heard the Imam say this, and then he came one day to the masjid and saw Aban teaching and issuing fatwas, that layperson, should they take the words of Aban or no? Of course they have to, because they heard their Imam commanding Aban to issue fatwas. That means the Imam alayhi salam is also commanding the people to accept his fatwas. That means the Imam is commanding people to do taqlid of Aban. That's evidence for taqlid. Because Aban is an expert, he's issuing fatwas in the masjid. The Imam alayhi salam is also indirectly telling his Shia, accept the words of Aban, do taqlid of him. He's qualified, he's trained. What are some counter arguments? Let me hear if you have any counter arguments. Yes. What was the guy's name? Aban. In Arabic, alif, ba, alif, noon. Aban, A-B-A-N, ibn Taghlib. Taghlib. Ta, ghain, lam, ba. He was a scholar. He was trained by the Imams, peace be upon them. He knew how the fiqh works. So the Imam commands him, sit in the masjid, afti nas. The Imam uses the word fatwa. You want clearer than that? Fatwa, fatwa. The Imam uses the word fatwa in the Sahih hadith. Give fatwa to the people. Then, if you think, oh, this was a special relationship between Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and Aban, because Aban had this divine position. No, the end of the hadith solves this for us. The Imam says, I love to see amongst my Shia people like you. That means qualified people who are honest, trustworthy scholars to go and give fatwas to the people. That means the Imam is encouraging people to become scholars and issue fatwas the right way. So we know it's not a special thing between the Imam and Aban. Because someone could argue the Imam is not legitimizing the entire system of taqlid. The Imam is saying only Aban you can do taqlid of him, but not others. The ending of the hadith shows otherwise. That the Imam is encouraging us to follow anyone like Aban. Any scholar like Aban who's qualified and he's giving fatwas, follow him. Yes, brother.
Were there scholars that were to give fatwa other than the Imams of that time?
Aban. That's the clearest example. Muhammad ibn Muslim, he would give fatwas. Zurara, he would give fatwas. Aban ibn Taghlib, Zakaria ibn Adam, they would all issue fatwas, authorized by the Imams themselves. We'll get to that. That's another part of our evidence for taqlid.
But
yes, brother.
The fatwas that they issued during the times of the Imams, were they like contradicting each other? But like we have today, like one Majnun says one thing, the other one says something else.
We can assume that they did not agree in 100% of the fatwas. Yes, there were less disagreements because they're closer to the source.
Yeah.
But I can tell you from the hadiths that we have, sometimes Zurara or Muhammad ibn Muslim or some other companions, they would disagree on some details. They would disagree on some details. Yet the Imam authorized that whole system. They would disagree. Sometimes, in fact, they would come in the presence of the Imam, they would quarrel. Muhammad ibn Muslim has deduced this, fatwa. It should be this way. The Imam had to calm them down. Yeah, it was common for them to have some minor differences. Yes, today the differences are greater because we're further away from the source. That's natural. It's just a natural historical consequence. Obviously, when you can see the Imam alayhi salam, you will have less differences, but they were still there. Not all the companions of the Imams were in complete agreement. In fact, if you remember from legal theory or some other classes, sometimes the Imam would deliberately cause differences amongst his companions. He would teach one companion a fatwa, he would teach another companion a contradicting fatwa to save the Shia for taqiyya purposes. We examined that in detail in legal theory, why the Imam would do that. Because if the Shia were known to have one unified opinion, the governments would go after them. It would be clearly a Shia opinion. They would get persecuted for that. Sometimes the Imam says, "Ana khalaftu baynahum." I caused, disunity among them. Imam Sadiq says that for a higher purpose, for another cause, to save the Shia historically. In any case, that's a different issue. Let's not get there now. This is something we discussed in legal theory in detail. But we have companions of the Imams, peace be upon them, commanded by the Imams, peace be upon them, to issue fatwas. That means the Imam is also commanding the Shia community to accept those fatwas once they hear those fatwas. You don't have access to the Imam? Go to Aban ibn Taghlib. He will give you the fatwa. Now the second part of this argument, you could argue, well, Aban was not doing any ijtihad. He was just a tape recorder. He hears the fatwa from Imam Sadiq. He sits in the masjid and tells you exactly what Imam Sadiq did. Not more, not less. That's not what the marji' is doing. The marji' uses his intellectual capacity. He puts proofs next to each other. He examines, he studies for 20 years, then he issues a fatwa. Someone can make that argument, right? This hadith by Imam Rida alayhi salam answers this objection. Ibn Idris, in his book Mustatrafat al-Sara'ir, he narrates a hadith from the book of Hisham ibn Salim, an Abi Abdullah al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And also this hadith is from Imam Rida alayhi salam. إنما علينا أن نلقي إليكم الأصول وعليكم أن تفرعوا. The Imam alayhi salam says, we the Imams of Ahlulbayt, we give you the guiding principles, the general laws, and you, my qualified companions, take them and branch out. apply them to specific cases. So now we know the Imams didn't just ask their companions to just convey the ruling verbatim from the Imam. The Imam is actually authorizing them to use their understanding of religion to apply cases, to apply principles to particular cases. We give you the usul, the general principles. But what about the details? Like istishab is a principle, the law of continuity. That you have to get from the Imam. You can't make it up by yourself. But how does the law of continuity apply to, in which case a scholar will spend 10 years figuring that out. The Imam says, that's up to you. You figure that out. See, the Imam is authorizing taqlid. So this will negate the possibility that the Imam is telling Aban, just sit and convey my words exactly. Don't use any type of, reasoning yourself. That is not the case. We have to break for salah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.